The candlelight inside Whitehall trembled against the walls, painting gold overwrought. On the throne sat Henry, swollen and breathless, his robes heavy with the scent of wax and sweat. The man once called the Lion of England now looked like a monument built by fear. His eyes, small and pale, searched the hall as if haunted by faces that would not rest. They had called him Defender of the Faith, the man who broke chains and built kingdoms. Yet the truth was darker. Behind every hymn sung in his name there was a scream buried in silence. The crown on his head no longer felt like glory. It pressed down like a sentence. Once he had been young, radiant, a prince of promise. His laughter filled the courts. His charm disarmed rivals. His words could bless or destroy with the same smile. But time had turned the prince into a god, and the god into a ghost. The body that once carried England now carried decay. The soul that demanded obedience now found no peace in prayer. History remembers his 6 wives, his wars, his splendor, but it forgets the 10 secrets that shaped the monster behind the crown. Secrets carved into the walls of his palaces, whispered by servants who never dared to speak again. This is not the story of love and power that the books repeat. It is the confession hidden between the lines, the truth that England tried to bury. If you wish to see what lies behind the mask of a king, stay until the end and subscribe to our channel. For the light of history often blinds, but the darkness remembers everything. They said he tore a kingdom apart for love, that Anne Boleyn bewitched him, that her eyes and her laughter made him defy the Pope and burn half of Europe's trust. But what if love was only the mask? What if the true reason England broke from Rome was not the passion of a man, but the hunger of a god? When Catherine of Aragon failed to give him a son, the silence inside the palace grew unbearable. The queen prayed until her lips bled. The king drank until dawn, and every empty cradle became a curse. Anne appeared in those years like a storm. She was sharp, untamed, and fearless. She did not yield to the king's gifts, nor did she bend to his charm. She made him wait. She made him beg. And in that humiliation, something inside Henry changed. He began to see desire not as pleasure, but as conquest. To possess Anne was to prove that no law, no priest, no god could deny him. His longing was not for her heart. It was for proof of his divinity. Every word he wrote to her carried the rhythm of prayer. Every promise was a command to heaven itself. Rome refused his request for annulment. The Pope's silence was louder than any insult. It reminded Henry that he was still a man beneath the crown. That single truth burned like poison. So he decided to destroy the very source of that reminder. If God would not give him permission, he would make himself God. He gathered his advisors, men who feared his eyes more than they feared damnation. They whispered that kings were anointed by heaven, and that no mortal power could bind their will. The idea consumed him. He began to dream of a world where every law flowed from his hand, where the word of the king was the voice of the Almighty. The Reformation was born not from love, but from pride. It was a rebellion dressed as romance. Anne became the altar upon which he offered his obedience to himself. When the Church of England was declared, the air in London trembled. Bells rang not for worship, but for warning. Priests were dragged from pulpits, monasteries stripped bare, relics smashed against the ground. The cross was no longer the symbol of salvation. It was the proof that the king had taken heaven for his own. Anne did not see it then. She believed she had won his heart, that her crown was the sign of love fulfilled. But the moment she placed it upon her head, she also wore the weight of his delusion. She was no longer his beloved. She was his creation, his evidence that no divine order stood above him. Every kiss between them was political, every glance a prayer to power, and as quickly as he had lifted her to the throne, he began to despise her for reminding him of the man he had been before he became his own god. Years later, when he watched her execution from afar, perhaps he remembered the day he swore before the crucifix that there would be no crown above his. Perhaps in that moment, as the sword fell and the crowd gasped, he realized the truth that history still struggles to admit. Henry did not divide England for love. He divided it because love reminded him that he was still human. The Tower of London stood like a wound upon the city. Its walls had seen the birth of kings and the silence of their victims. In the spring air, a gray mist drifted across the river, and inside that mist, 2 queens waited to die. They were not martyrs for sin, nor traitors to the throne. They were the mirrors that showed Henry what he could no longer bear to see. Anne Boleyn had once been his triumph, the reason he had defied Rome. Her name was spoken in fear and envy. She carried herself like fire, sharp, alive, a queen who had risen not by blood but by defiance. Yet that same fire soon frightened him. When she failed to give him the son he longed for, the whispers began. Adultery, witchcraft, conspiracy. None of it mattered whether it was true. Truth was no longer what the king desired. What he desired was silence. The trial was only a ritual. The outcome had been decided before she entered the hall. Anne stood in her gray gown, pale but proud, her voice steady as she spoke her innocence. She forgave her enemies. She prayed for her husband. She accepted her fate. When the French swordsman raised his blade, the crowd held its breath. The blow fell, swift and perfect. The body trembled once, and then there was only stillness. The woman who had changed the world was gone, and the king felt nothing. They said he rode out the next morning to meet Jane Seymour. He wore white. He smiled. To him, the execution was not a loss. It was a purification. But years later, when Catherine Howard arrived at court, young, full of laughter, he thought he saw youth returning to him. She danced. She sang. She called him sweet names. For a while he believed that joy had found its way back into the palace. Yet joy was dangerous to a man who ruled by fear. The same rumors began again, soft at first, then spreading like a plague. Letters, glances, secrets whispered between guards. Catherine was arrested and taken to the Tower, the same stone corridors where Anne had prayed before her death. The girl was barely 19. She had no understanding of politics or betrayal. She only knew that the king no longer looked at her with love. On the night before her execution, she asked to see the block. She placed her neck upon it and whispered that it seemed very short and that she hoped to be brave. In the morning, she dressed in white and walked to her death without trembling. Her voice was clear as she said she died as the king's true wife, though not lawfully his queen. When the axe fell, her ladies fainted. The crowd turned away. Henry did not watch. He remained in his chamber, staring into the fire, saying nothing. The palace was quiet that night. Even the music in the great hall stopped. 2 queens had died by his will, and yet it was not lust or vengeance that guided his hand. It was shame. He could not bear the reflection of his own weakness. Anne had shown him ambition without obedience. Catherine had reminded him of beauty that could not be bought. Both were reminders that the king, beneath the robes and titles, was still a man who could be rejected, still a man who could be forgotten. He destroyed them not to protect the crown, but to protect the illusion of himself. Each death was a mirror smashed, each blade a desperate attempt to silence the truth that love had already left him. The tower kept their voices. The guards who walked its halls swore they could hear silk brushing against stone, the faint steps of women moving through the mist, never finding peace. Their ghosts did not haunt to curse him. They haunted to remind England what power truly costs. History calls them wives, victims, symbols. But their blood was the ink that wrote his legend. And without them, the throne would have had no shadow to hide behind. The bells of Hampton Court rang through the fog, heavy and slow. Mourning and celebration mixed into one. A son had been born at last. The kingdom rejoiced. The priests sang. The courtiers knelt on the cold marble floor. Henry had finally been given what he believed heaven had long denied him: an heir. The proof that God had blessed his reign. Yet as the cries of joy echoed across the palace, another sound filled the chamber. The fading breath of Jane Seymour. She lay pale against the pillows, her hands weak, her skin almost translucent beneath the candlelight. The midwives whispered prayers. The servants moved quietly, and Henry stood at her bedside in silence. For years he had demanded a son from heaven, and now heaven had answered with a trade, life for life. Jane smiled once, barely, when they placed the infant in her arms, and then her eyes drifted upward as if she saw something beyond the room. She whispered only one word before the end: Edward. Henry called her his true wife, the only one who had given him what he desired. He ordered that she be buried in a queen's tomb, wrapped in white linen and gold thread. But the court noticed how still he had become. He ate little, he spoke less, and when he did, his voice sounded like a prayer spoken to an empty church. The child was baptized in water and incense. The king watched from behind the curtains, his face unreadable. He had his heir now, his legacy secured, yet victory felt hollow. The palace smelled of death and milk. In the cradle lay the symbol of his triumph. But every time the baby cried, Henry heard the echo of the woman who had died to give him that sound. He began to visit the chapel more often. He would stand before the altar, not kneeling, not praying, simply staring at the crucifix. The image of Christ seemed different to him now, not holy, but familiar. A man suffering for the sins of another. The king whispered that all glory comes with pain, and that perhaps even God must envy him. At night, he walked the halls alone. The torches burned low, casting shadows on the walls like ghosts that would not fade. In the reflection of the windows, he sometimes thought he saw Jane, not in beauty, but in sorrow. Her face pale, her lips moving without sound, her hands reaching for something that was no longer there. To the people of England, Jane Seymour became the perfect queen, gentle, loyal, pure. To Henry, she was the proof that God had not forsaken him. Yet deep inside, he knew she had been the price. For every prayer he had forced from others, this was the one heaven had demanded in return. He spoke of her often, but never with joy. He kept her portrait near his bed until the end of his days. When courtiers praised her memory, he would nod, then change the subject. He built no monument greater than her tomb, as if afraid that any word more might break the silence that protected him from guilt. Edward grew frail and quiet, too delicate for the weight of the crown he was born to carry. Each time Henry saw the boy, his pride flickered with unease. The child's thin fingers, the hollow eyes, the weak cough that followed him like a shadow. All reminded the king that power had a cost. He had begged for a son to secure eternity, and heaven had answered with fragility. Jane's death marked the beginning of his decay. The king who once defied Rome now found himself haunted by a ghost that asked for nothing but remembrance. The throne had its heir, but the man upon it was hollow. In the years that followed, when courtiers toasted to the birth of the Tudor prince, Henry would raise his cup, smile faintly, and drink without speaking. For every victory he had ever claimed, he knew the truth. The boy had been born from guilt, and guilt would be the last thing to survive him. The body of the king had once been a symbol of power. In his youth, he rode through the streets of London in shining armor, his frame broad and strong, his hair golden beneath the sun. But years of hunger for control had devoured him from within. The man who once inspired fear now inspired pity. His legs had swollen until his boots could no longer close. His breath came heavy. His temper flared without reason, and beneath the layers of silk and fur, his flesh was rotting. It began as a small injury, a cut from the saddle after a fall in a tournament. The wound never healed. It festered, spreading through the skin, darkening, thickening, releasing a stench that no perfume could mask. The royal physicians tried every remedy known to their time. Herbs, wine, even crushed pearls mixed with oil. But the infection returned again and again. The pain turned him cruel. He shouted at the servants who cleaned the bandages, struck the doctors who dared to look away, and demanded that they praise him for his strength while they watched him bleed. The wound became more than disease. It became a reflection. It showed what the kingdom itself had become, glorious on the surface, but rotting beneath the weight of its own pride. Each morning as the bandages were unwrapped, the king stared at the pus and blood and saw the cost of every execution, every decree signed in anger, every prayer turned into command. The flesh of England was dying, and he was its mirror. The courtiers began to avoid his chamber. The smell clung to their clothes, to their hair, to their sleep. Yet none dared to speak. They called it divine trial. They said it was the burden of greatness. But in their hearts they whispered that the king was cursed. At night, when the candles burned low, he would wake from dreams of fire and hear the sound of his own blood dripping to the floor. Sometimes he thought he saw figures moving in the corner of the room, the faces of the women he had condemned. They came without anger, only with silence, as if to remind him that nothing heals what is earned in cruelty. His anger became a weapon against the pain. He ordered new taxes, new arrests, new deaths. Each command was an attempt to feel alive, to prove that he still ruled over something other than his own decay. The priests spoke of penance, but Henry no longer believed in forgiveness. He had become both sinner and judge, both wound and knife. There were days when the infection grew so severe that he could not stand. The throne was brought to his chamber so that the council could kneel before him while he sat in his bed, his leg hidden beneath layers of linen, the fabric soaked through by afternoon, the smell of iron and sickness filling the room. Still he gave orders. Still he spoke of strength. The people of London no longer saw their king. They saw only the stories that drifted from the palace, of the great monarch who ruled from a bed of pain, whose leg dripped blood like oil from a cracked crown. The myth grew, twisted and terrifying. Mothers told their children that the king's wound was punishment for the blood he had spilled, that his body was paying for the sins his soul refused to confess. And in a way, it was true. The leg that carried a king now carried rot. The body that once conquered nations was now a prison of its own making. No medicine could cure him, because the disease was not in his flesh. It was in the echo of his choices. Toward the end, when the doctors begged him to rest, he laughed and told them that a king never rests, that the realm moves when he breathes. But even as he said the words, he could feel the truth spreading beneath his skin, slow and certain. The wound that never healed was not his punishment. It was his confession, the only one he would ever give. In the last decade of his reign, the palace grew darker. Curtains were kept drawn even at midday. The smell of medicine and smoke filled the chambers. Henry spent long hours behind closed doors, surrounded by jars of powders, flasks of colored liquid, and scrolls written in Latin. The great conqueror of England had become a student of alchemy. He no longer trusted the church, the priests, or the doctors. He believed that somewhere in the mixture of earth and blood, there was an answer that God had denied him. The records speak of strange experiments. Servants whispered about fires that burned blue, of powders made from crushed bones, of blood from animals mixed with wine. The king's hands were often stained, his fingers trembling as he poured one vial into another. He believed that if he could master the secret of transformation, he could turn pain into strength, flesh into spirit, death into eternity. At night, he demanded that the windows remain open so that the smoke of his mixtures could rise toward heaven. He called it his offering. The courtiers called it madness. Yet none dared to stop him. To question the king was to vanish before dawn. The truth was that Henry no longer feared sin. He feared time. The ticking of the clocks in Whitehall became the sound of his punishment. Every hour that passed reminded him that power could not command youth to return. His body was collapsing, his breath growing shallow, his heart heavy. The world outside was moving forward, and he was trapped in a shell that would not obey. He summoned astrologers and healers, promising gold for any who could restore his vigor. They gave him potions thick as tar, mixtures of mercury and herbs, charms carved into metal, prayers written on parchment soaked in oil. He drank them all, coughing, sweating, yet always believing the next one might work. He would stare into the mirror afterward, searching for signs that the hand of death had loosened its grip. The mirror never lied. Sometimes he spoke to himself while mixing the ingredients. Servants heard him whisper that the blood of kings was sacred, that it carried the fire of creation. He believed that by consuming the essence of life, he could become immortal. But each attempt left him weaker, the veins in his hands darker, the pulse slower. The line between science and sorcery had vanished, and the king walked it alone. In the chapel, the priests continued to pray for him, but he stopped attending Mass. He claimed that faith was not found in heaven, but in the will to survive. Those who knew him best saw a man terrified of the silence that waited after his last breath. To Henry, death was not the end. It was the one thing that would finally strip him of his control. The alchemy of fear became his new religion. The fire that burned in his chamber was his God. The smoke was his prayer. He told his attendants that he could feel the essence of power in the fumes, that it entered his lungs and carried him beyond pain. but each breath only filled him with poison. His flesh yellowed, his eyes clouded, his voice broke into wheezing gasps. The night before one of his worst fevers, he ordered the candles to remain lit and demanded to be left alone. When the guards entered in the morning, they found him sitting by the dying flames, his hands blackened, the air heavy with a metallic scent. On the table stood a single glass bottle half filled with a dark red liquid. No one dared to touch it. They said he had smiled before collapsing. Some believed he had seen something in that final mixture, something that convinced him the secret of immortality was close. Others thought he had simply lost the last of his humanity. Whatever he saw that night, it did not save him. His body continued to decay. His mind grew restless, and the throne that once carried his glory had become a cage. In the end, the man who tried to turn death into gold found only ashes. England buried him beside Jane Seymour, the only woman he claimed to have truly loved. The stone that sealed their tomb bore no words of apology, no prayer, only the cold simplicity of his title. Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of all. Yet beyond those words, there was another truth, one that history has never stopped repeating. He was not only the maker of a nation, he was the undoing of himself. The river outside the palace carried the sound of bells toward the city. The same river that had once mirrored his triumphs now mirrored his silence. The people who had knelt in fear now knelt in habit, not devotion. The empire he built with his will would outlive him, but the faith he destroyed would never return. In the end, his legacy was not carved in marble or written in gold. It was carved in flesh, in blood, in the quiet suffering of those who stood too close to his crown. The 6 wives, the courtiers, the priests, the sons and daughters, all became part of a single story. The story of a man who wanted to be more than human and died learning that no one ever can. History calls him powerful. Time calls him tragic. Every palace he built, every law he wrote, every church he claimed as his own still carries the echo of his footsteps, heavy, slow, and unrepentant. And if you walk through the Tower of London at night, when the wind moves through the gates and the river fog rises from below, they say you can still hear it. The faint ring of a crown against stone, the whisper of a king who wanted to live forever. His name endures, not because he conquered, but because he reminds us what happens when a man tries to conquer himself. If you have heard his story and still believe history has darker truths yet to tell, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, where the light fades and the shadows begin to speak.